Welcome to a new session of the Executive Program, United States in the 21st Century of the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina. From this meeting, which will be focused on the US Gran Strategy, we will start discussing about the US foreign and national security policy in the world, in Latin America, and finally, how it impacts on the US-Argentina relations. In this first part of this section, we have the pleasure to have a very special guest, Dr. Hal Brands, a leading voice on the debate on the US Grand Strategy. Hal is Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. He's author of several books, including American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump, What Good is Grand Strategy, Power and Purpose in American Statecraft from Henry Truman to George W. Bush, and Latin America's Cold War, among others. Hal served as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning from 2015 to 2016. He has also served as lead writer for the Commission of the National Defense Strategy for the United States. As I said before, the dynamics of the session will be the next. Hal will deliver a talk during the first 45 minutes, and then we will open a Q&A session for another 40 minutes. We will be very glad if you can write the questions in the chat box in English. In case you want to deliver the questions in Spanish, please send us a message to Carolina, to me, and we will translate it. Hal, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Ariel. I really appreciate the invitation. I wish I could be there with all of you. It's been far too long since I was in Argentina, but instead I'm in the bunker here as a result of COVID. And so I am going to, I guess, set the stage for the series of discussions that you'll be having. And I'm going to try to take a big picture view on American foreign policy, or American grand strategy as I think of it, in the post-Cold War era. And so basically since the end of the 1980s up to today, so about a 30-year period. And I'm going to start actually by going back even farther than that, because I don't think that you can understand what the United States chose to do after the end of the Cold War without understanding the foreign policy that the United States pursued after World War II. And so I'm going to talk about that deep history, and then I will talk about the post-Cold War era, and then I will talk about where we've been under President Trump and where we may be going either under a second Trump administration or under a Biden administration, which looks more and more likely these days, although one never knows. And so the point that I want to start with is that World War II really marked a grand strategic revolution for the United States. And so prior to World War II, the United States had never really been a truly isolationist power. The United States had been involved economically and diplomatically in Europe and Asia. The United States had colonial holdings in the Philippines. It had obviously been engaged in numerous military interventions in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Central America and the Caribbean. But the United States had largely followed a strategic concept which held that it did not need to make strategic commitments outside of the Western Hemisphere. And in fact, US intervention in World War I was an aberration from the historical norm of relative avoidance of European wars in particular. All that really changes with World War II. And World War II shifts the way that American leaders think about foreign policy. It shifts the way they think about the international environment. And so what I like to say is that World War II made American leaders adopt a foreign policy that was rooted in a dual logic, a twofold logic of interdependence and indispensability. And so by interdependence, I mean that American policymakers concluded from the events of the 1930s and the 1940s, the Great Depression, and then World War II, that the United States could not be safe in a world that was unstable or that was dominated by aggressive dictatorships, that it could not be prosperous in a world that was racked by depression. And that if there were big problems in the world, economic, political, or military, those problems would eventually reach out and touch the United States, as the policies that Japan and Germany had followed in the 1930s and early 1940s had done. And so the base takeaway was that in a world that was becoming smaller, an increasingly interdependent world, the United States was not an island. And so the United States had to take on a larger role in the world. It basically had to look after not only its own narrow interests, but to try to create a larger international environment in which the United States would be secure and prosperous and influential in all the things that American policymakers wanted to be. And that the United States could best do that by helping like-minded countries that viewed the world in the same way, strengthen and fortify themselves. And so that was the logic of interdependence. The logic of indispensability was pretty simple. It was that nobody else was capable of doing this. So when American policymakers looked at the international environment after World War II, much of the world was in ruins. Many of the European powers had been kicked out of parts of their colonial empires. They had suffered terrible economic and human losses. The British, who had largely been the reigning world power in the decades and even centuries before World War II, were essentially bankrupt and were no longer able to play their stabilizing role. And so if the United States didn't take on responsibility for forging this relatively benign international order, there was no one else who could do it. Or even worse, the international system might be led by aggressive authoritarian powers like the Soviet Union that had a very different view of how the world should work. And so that was where the indispensability came in. And so even before the Cold War broke out, although it was accelerated by the Cold War, American policymakers decided that the United States was going to have to take the lead in creating a prosperous international economy, creating a stable international system, and hopefully averting a return to the great power conflicts that had brought about World War II. These were all decisions that American policymakers made during World War II in 1942, 1943, 1944, while the fighting was still going on, because the United States was planning very deliberately for the post-war period. And this agenda was reinforced by the emergence of the Cold War. The fact that there was this threat, real or perceived, to the United States in the form of the Soviet Union made American policymakers even more assertive in trying to shape a world that was congenial to American interests. And so the United States forges military alliances in regions around the globe, which were meant both to contain the Soviet Union, but also to pacify the relations between former enemies like France and Germany, countries that had gone at it before, or Japan and the countries around it. It had military deployments around the world. This was the first time the United States had essentially a permanent peacetime military presence in Europe or in East Asia in considerable numbers. Again, the idea being that these would deter aggression and provide stability. The United States led international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF and the GATT in an effort to promote a flourishing international economy and promote cooperation on terms that American officials could accept. And so there were a variety of policies that the United States pursued to try to shape a world order that was congenial to its interests. And they also tried to shape a world order that was congenial to American values. The United States did not, of course, promote democracy or human rights in every instance, and particularly during the Cold War, particularly in the Third World, and in some cases, particularly in Latin America, the United States made some pretty severe moral compromises to work with friendly authoritarian powers who were reliably anti-communist. But in a broad sense, the goal of American foreign policy was to create a world in which democratic values could flourish. And over time, the United States became more willing to promote democracy and human rights in specific cases as well by the time we got to the late 1970s and 1980s in particular. Now, this was never a perfect foreign policy. It was never a perfect program in any respect. There were lots of mistakes that American policymakers made. There were interventions that had horrific consequences for the people in the countries that the United States intervened in, and so on and so forth. But if you look at it from sort of the very highest level, the world that resulted after World War II was a pretty good world. The world the economy grew faster than it had ever grown before, not just in the United States, but globally. The international system had suffered through two great power wars in a generation, in World War I and World War II. There has not been a great power war since 1945. Democracy spread more widely than it had ever spread before, and existed and still exists in a bit over half of the countries in the world. And of course, the United States and its allies were successful in containing the Soviet Union and ultimately bringing about the peaceful end of the Cold War. And so all of those were, I think, considerable achievements, and they set the stage for the decisions that American policymakers have to make when the Cold War ends. And so it's hard to remember now, but when the Cold War ended in the period between about 1989 and 1991, it didn't necessarily look like the post-Cold War period was going to be stable and was going to be peaceful. There was a really interesting essay written by an American political scientist, a guy named John Mearsheimer, in 1990 called "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War." And the basic idea was that the Cold War had kind of stifled all of the normal tensions between states in Europe in particular. That the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union had divided up the continent in a bipolar fashion, that nuclear deterrence had prevailed, had created essentially an artificial peace in Europe. But once the Cold War ended, all of the old historical demons were going to reemerge, and Germany and Poland and Russia would once again be at each other's throats, and there would be rampant nuclear proliferation, and you would see extreme nationalism, which in fact we did see in places like Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And if you looked around the world, in fact, there were a variety of crises. Before the Cold War even fully ended, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, touching off a major crisis involving the world's energy supply in the Persian Gulf. And so the choice that American policymakers faced was, now that the Cold War is over, do we pull back from these positions that we have held over the past 45 years because the immediate danger has gone away? Or do we lean forward? Do we keep going in an effort to sustain the relatively benign international environment that we and our friends have helped to create? And of course, what they decided to do was to keep going, essentially to double down on the policies and the achievements of the Cold War, because they worried that Mearsheimer might be right, that the pulling back might jeopardize everything that the United States had worked for. And so the United States plays a very active role in the crises surrounding the end of the Cold War: German reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Persian Gulf crisis and war in 1990, and others. And essentially, American policymakers just decide that they are going to keep doing what they've been doing for the past 45 years, although they're going to adapt that strategy a little bit for the more favorable circumstances of the post-Cold War era, when there was no peer challenger to the United States. There was no other country that could rival the United States in power terms. And so the goal of maintaining a favorable balance of power becomes the goal of preserving American preeminence, American unipolarity. The goal of protecting the free world becomes the goal of expanding what we now think of as the liberal international order. The United States increasingly promotes the spread of democracy and free markets during the 1990s. And American policymakers say, we want to deter or defeat any of the threats that might mess all of this up, whether it's nuclear proliferation to rogue states like North Korea or Iran, whether it is international terrorism, which really emerged as a significant threat during the 1990s, or whether it's the reemergence of rival great powers. And so from the start, American policymakers hoped they worried rather that Russia might once again become a challenger to the United States. They worried that China could grow to a point where it might disrupt the order in East Asia. But they said, we think we can manage this because on the one hand, we are going to deter these powers from challenging the status quo. On the other hand, we're going to try to integrate them into this booming global economy so they'll see that there is more to gain by being a part of the system than being outside of it. And so these were the basic policy decisions that were made. And what's remarkable is that the United States essentially just keeps doing a lot of the things it was doing. So America doesn't back away from its alliances after the end of the Cold War. It maintains and even expands them in NATO's cases. It doesn't bring all of its troops home from abroad. There are still American troops in Europe and East Asia and other places today. The United States continues to promote free trade and so on and so forth. And all of these policies, I would say, were followed by each of the four administrations that followed the Cold War: George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. There was lots of variation in specific policies. Obviously, Bill Clinton's Iraq policy was very different than George W. Bush's approach to Iraq. There was always debate about American policy toward China, for instance. But at a relatively high level, you can see decent continuity in American foreign policy over time, centered on these ideas of maintaining and expanding alliances as sources of stability, maintaining forward force deployments, promoting human rights and democracy, promoting free trade, deterring rivals, and dealing with emerging threats. And the argument that I would make, which is a little bit controversial, is that this was actually a pretty reasonable foreign policy to follow. Again, there were lots of terrible mistakes that American policymakers made. Sometimes they did too little, as in the case of Rwanda in 1994. Sometimes they did too much, as in the case of invading Iraq in 2003. Sometimes they managed to do too much and too little at the same time. But on the whole, the post-Cold War era was more benign than most people expected. And we didn't get a rapid return to great power competition in Europe during the 1990s, for instance. In fact, most of Europe remains a relatively peaceful place today. The United States played a key role in preventing actors like Iraq from destabilizing the Persian Gulf in the 1990s. The United States was one of many actors that contributed to the spread of democracy to levels that had never been seen before, or to the achievements of globalization during the 1990s and 2000s. And so there were mistakes. There are always mistakes, but I would actually argue that compared to any other 25-year period in American history, the post-Cold War era, the period between about 1991 and 2016, actually looks okay by comparison. And so the question obviously arises, if I'm right about this, if U.S. policy was relatively good, then why is American foreign policy and the international order that American foreign policy supports under so much strain today? And there's no denying that it's under strain. If you look around the world, there are challenges to the international system the United States has led. There are challenges to American power. At home, the United States is not doing as well as it would like to be, and so on and so forth. And I think there are a variety of reasons for this. Let me just mention a few of the factors that gradually imposed greater strain on American policy over time. One piece of it, obviously, was American overreach, particularly in the era after September 11th, 2001. Those attacks revealed a great deal of American vulnerability, even at a time of unrivaled American power. And so the United States responded in a way that I don't think was surprising, by sort of going on the offensive to try to root out threats, whether in Afghanistan or perceived threats in Iraq, but that ultimately had some pretty negative consequences. It's particularly the Iraq War. And so the sense that the United States had gotten itself into a position of overstretch in Iraq in particular has caused a blowback that has weakened U.S. foreign policy today. And so I think that's a fair critique. A second problem was what you might think of as a failure of integration. And so one of the things we're seeing now is obviously that great power competition has returned. The United States is being challenged by China and by Russia. And that reflects a mistaken view in American foreign policy during the 1980s, or a bet that didn't pay off, rather, I guess is a better way of putting it. And so many of you may have heard of the idea of the responsible stakeholder. This was the notion that by drawing China into the international system after the Cold War, the United States would reconcile China to that system. China would become more prosperous, so it would have less reason to disrupt the international system. It would become more democratic over time as well, because as the standard of living of Chinese people grew, as you had a middle class emerge, that middle class would demand greater political rights. This is the formula that had led to democratization in many countries during the 1970s and 1980s. And so American policymakers hoped that it would be true in China as well. That's obviously not how things turned out. The Communist Party of China proved very effective at sort of pocketing the gains of economic integration into the world economy while suppressing any anti-regime sentiment in China. And so by 2015, 2016, it was pretty clear that the United States wasn't dealing with kind of a pacified, sedate China. It was dealing with an increasingly aggressive China, a China that was increasingly authoritarian as well, and that this aspect of American foreign policy had not paid off. There was a similar experience with Russia during the 1990s. The Clinton administration worked very hard to try to promote democratization in Russia. That was always going to be an extremely difficult challenge. It was one that the United States was ultimately not able to achieve. And so we saw a reversion to authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin and a reversion to a more hostile relationship with the United States as well. A third problem was that globalization had some pernicious effects within the United States. It had a lot of beneficial effects. It also had some pernicious effects around the world, and that was true within the United States as well. And so the United States becomes much more prosperous in the aggregate as a result of the policies of international financial liberalization in particular undertaken during the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s. But what we now know is that these policies had the effect of compounding the strains on part of the American population. So the white working class in particular, the lower middle class, these were parts of the American population that were already suffering economically as a result of things like automation, which was doing away with a great number of industrial jobs. Free trade policies, particularly vis-a-vis China, didn't create this pressure, but they did exacerbate this pressure. And so over time, there came about a growing American disillusion in places like Ohio, for instance, with the foreign policies the United States had pursued. And that opened the door for somebody like Donald Trump in 2016, who campaigned against globalization. And then a final thing I would mention is that American alliances became increasingly unbalanced over time. And so American alliances had always been based on a bargain, which was that the United States would carry more than its share of the load in terms of helping a country like West Germany or Japan defend itself, but that those countries would still make good faith efforts to contribute to the common defense. The challenge was that during the 1990s and 2000s, the traditional threats to those countries seemed to disappear. And so they actually cut their defense spending more significantly than the United States did. And so what happened was that if you looked at NATO, for instance, during the Cold War, at times during the Cold War at least, the United States accounted for about 50 to 60% of NATO's military spending. By the early 2010s, it had become about 75%. And there were many NATO countries that really weren't able to contribute much in the way of military capability to NATO missions in places like Libya, for instance. The British and the French could, the Dutch a little bit, but beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot. And so I think even during the Obama administration, American policymakers were wondering whether the bargain on which American alliances had been based was fraying at the edges. And again, that set the stage for Donald Trump as well. And so I think as a result of these things, discomfort with imbalances in the international economy, discomfort with imbalances in American alliances, a sense of overstretch in the Middle East, and growing concern about what American officials like to call great power competition, particularly with China, there was going to be a change in American foreign policy, regardless of who won the election in 2016. You would have seen a shift towards a firmer China policy under Hillary Clinton as well, for example. But of course, it wasn't Hillary Clinton who won. It was Donald Trump. And so Trump is a unique figure in a lot of ways, as anyone who has watched him over the past 4 years can attest. And I think if you had a Clinton presidency, Clinton would have focused mostly on trying to tweak American foreign policy at the margins to sustain the grand strategy the United States had pursued after the Cold War in more difficult settings. Trump had a somewhat different perspective. And so what you have to understand about Trump is that President Trump rejects the entire logic of American foreign policy since 1945, since World War II. And he in particular rejects a series of key beliefs that American policymakers have had about the world. So American policymakers have thought, sort of in a very broad sense, that the world could be positive sum, that the United States could do well by helping its friends do well. President Trump sees international relations in a different light. He tends to see them in zero-sum terms. Either the United States is getting the best of the deal or somebody else is getting the best of the deal. And that applies, in his view, to U.S. relations with allies as well as competitors. The president has always had a weird preference for dealing with dictators as opposed to democratic allies. Back in the late 1980s, he praised the Chinese Communist Party for killing several hundred or perhaps several thousand of its own citizens in the Tiananmen Square incident. He has long said he thinks it's easier to get things done with authoritarian leaders than with democratic leaders. And he believes that free trade and alliances are fundamentally bad deals for the United States, that they're not things that the United States does to advance its interests, that they are tools by which other countries, whether it's Japan or Germany, exploit the United States and essentially find ways of taking America's wealth from it while not contributing to their own defense. He's had these views for about 30, 35 years. If you go back and look at the things he wrote in the late 1980s about this, or the advertisements that he took out in the New York Times, they say precisely this. And so his core views on foreign policy haven't changed over time. Now, some of these views had at least a grain of truth to them. It is true, for instance, that China had used unfair trade practices to take advantage of a variety of countries during the 2000s and 2010s. What made Trump's approach during the campaign so jarring was that he seemed to be junking the entire intellectual logic of American foreign policy. And he even adopted the label America First. And the reason that was so striking was America First was the motto that was used by the anti-interventionists, the isolationists, in the debate over whether the United States should enter World War II back in the late 1930s and 1940s. And America First was a movement that was too often associated with anti-Semitic figures, for instance. And so that seemed to be a real warning sign to people in the American foreign policy establishment. And indeed, virtually the entire Republican Party foreign policy apparatus publicly repudiated Trump before the 2016 election. There were a couple of open letters that were signed by leading figures within the Republican Party national security community saying, we think this guy would be a bad president and we don't want to work for him. And so as a result of that, when President Trump won the election and he took power, he was a real outlier within the Republican Party. He did not have a coterie of close advisors around him who could help turn his America First vision into a reality. And so you ended up with a very odd dynamic in U.S. foreign policy, particularly in 2017 and 2018. So the president ended up surrounding himself with people like Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, and before that, the Department of Homeland Security head, H.R. McMaster, his National Security Advisor, Rex Tillerson at the State Department. And what all these people had in common was that they basically didn't agree with the president on foreign policy issues. They were what you might think of as traditional Republican Party figures. They believed that the foreign policy that Americans had followed since World War II was a good thing. They thought it needed to be adapted in a variety of ways, but they didn't want to just throw the entire thing out in the way that it sometimes seemed that the president did. And so this led to some rather tense meetings within the administration. And there was one meeting in particular. It was held at the Pentagon, at America's Department of Defense, in the summer of 2017, where Mattis and Tillerson and others put up a map of the world, tried to show the president where the United States had alliances, where it had military bases, where it had free trade agreements, and why all this was good. And the president simply wasn't having it. And the meeting turned into a big disaster. There was a big argument about it, and it really ruptured the relationship between the president and Rex Tillerson in particular. And so what we saw during the early phase of Trump's presidency was that there was sort of a tug of war over American foreign policy. The president would go in one direction. His advisors would then try to take the United States in the other direction. And so Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, spent a lot of time trying to strengthen U.S. ties with NATO. American funding for something called the European Deterrence Initiative, which is what we and our allies do to try to deter Russia and Eastern Europe, increased under the Trump administration. And yet the president regularly talked about how little he liked NATO and how he would like to withdraw and how he didn't think the United States necessarily needed to defend its allies if they were attacked. And in fact, there's been some reporting that at one point the president actually was on the verge of withdrawing from NATO before he was dissuaded by his advisors. His advisors tried to keep him in the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, not because they loved Iran, they didn't, but because they thought it was working in terms of restraining an Iranian nuclear capability. But the president didn't like it because it was an Obama deal, and so he withdrew from it. People like McMaster and Mattis tried to get the president to focus his attention on great power competition, on China and Russia in particular, but the president tended to be more interested in counterterrorism or in the crisis in Venezuela, for instance, or the North Korean crisis. And so he was focused on other things. And you can really see this conflict come out in two of the major documents that the US government produces on foreign policy. And so one is the National Security Strategy, which was released in late 2017. The other is the National Defense Strategy, which is released in early 2018. These are basically conventional documents. They look like they could have been written by any Republican administration. They talk about the need to preserve American influence, to compete with China and Russia, and so on and so forth, to raise great power competition to the top level of American priorities, to demote counterterrorism, and things like that. And the president's own behavior is often utterly contradictory to these things. So when the National Security Strategy was released, this is nominally President Trump's document. He gave a speech the same day, which went totally in the opposite direction and made it seem as though he hadn't even read the document. He has tried to, for instance, dramatically reduce funding for the State Department and USAID, even though those institutions are emphasized in his own strategy documents. And so there has been, and there continues to be, an incredible tension in American foreign policy between the president, who would really like to reverse a number of American foreign policy initiatives, and the advisors around him who had been more traditional, although he's changed the balance of those advisors in 2019 and 2020. So I think we do need to give credit where credit is due. I think the Trump administration has done some things fairly well, or at least they've identified some problems that needed identifying. I think that the president spoke more clearly, particularly the president's advisors spoke more clearly about the challenge that China poses to the United States and to much of the democratic world than any of the administrations that had come before them. I think that the administration has spoken clearly about some of the challenges the United States faces in alliance management. I think those are real problems. They deserve to be emphasized. The challenge was always that when it came to building constructive policies, the administration fell short. And so, yes, the administration identified the need for better burden sharing within NATO, but it has so alienated so many of America's closest allies that it's actually weakened that alliance instead. The president gets credit for identifying the challenge from China, but if you look at what the administration has done to build out a China strategy, there are entire chunks of it that are still missing. There's still no real economic counterbalancing strategy for China, in part because the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama had negotiated. There's still not much of a strategy to help develop alternatives so that countries don't have to become dependent on Chinese technology. We're just sanctioning China without offering much of a positive incentive to other countries. And so I think the concern that I have and that a number of other people have is that the United States may be getting tough with China, to use the phrase, but it's actually weakening the relationships that it would need to preserve its influence and preserve its position in a competition against China. And I would say that more broadly, this is the major problem in U.S. foreign policy today. The problem isn't that the president has been as radical as we might expect, in part because he has been constrained. And so the president hasn't withdrawn from NATO. He hasn't withdrawn from the World Trade Organization, so far at least. But on a variety of areas, the United States has sustained real damage to its foreign policy as a result of the president's behavior, his mannerisms, a variety of the things that he does. And I'm not going to go into great detail on these things because I think they will be relatively familiar to folks. And if you just look at the most recent survey of America's global favorability ratings in countries around the world, the U.S. image is atrocious right now. It's embarrassingly low. Negative views of President Trump, the United States, are incredibly high at the moment, and that for a variety of reasons. One of these is that I worry that under the Trump administration, the United States has walked back from its role as being a principled advocate, not in all cases, but in most cases of human rights and democracy. The president has regularly made clear that he enjoys dealing with dictators like Kim Jong-un, as opposed to democratic allies like Angela Merkel in Germany. He has cast doubt on American alliance commitments and the whole idea that the United States has special relationships with its democratic allies. And so those relationships are incredibly strained at the political level, even though in the day-to-day sense they remain okay. I think the United States has really weakened the perception that it is a competent leader in foreign policy, that it can handle complex challenges in an efficient way. And this is just the result of sort of the shambolic performance we've seen out of the White House on a variety of issues. And you can see that the United States has simply ceased to provide much leadership on many of the challenges that matter most to the world. If you look at climate change, if you look at the resurgence of protectionism, if you look at the global refugee crisis, if you look at COVID, the United States is largely absent from multilateral efforts to deal with those challenges. And I think this is a real problem for the United States. The United States is still going to be a very powerful country, but if the United States is only standing for its own power, which is the message that Trump often puts out, why would anyone sign up to follow us, right? The reason that the United States has a lot of friends around the world is that the United States has usually managed to stand for something beyond its own self-enrichment. It stood for a concept of international order that has benefited not all countries, but many countries around the world. And so if the United States gets away from that, I worry that it could really rupture many of the relationships on which the United States depends. Now that brings us to COVID. And COVID has made all of the problems that I just identified in American Grand Strategy worst. It has raised further doubts about basic American competence in dealing with significant challenges. It probably won't be news to anyone that the American response to COVID has been very, very poor, and we're still struggling to get our arms around that challenge. COVID has shifted the psychological balance of power, if not the material balance of power. It certainly seems like a moment when China is able to act more assertively because the United States is distracted and handicapped. COVID has raised doubts about the stability of democracies. It's raised doubts about the prospect for future economic growth. It's raised fears of deglobalization and so on and so forth. And so you see very smart observers who are worrying that this could be the end of the international system that the United States and its friends helped to create after World War II. Now, I'm not quite that pessimistic. I think that there are some potentially quite positive outcomes that could come out of COVID. Crises are, after all, opportunities. And so I think that if I were just to identify 4 opportunities for the United States that have emerged out of COVID, I think it's clear that there is growing international concern about China coming out of COVID, stemming from the role that China played in covering up the initial outbreak and then being very aggressive in its diplomacy since the outbreak. And so there might be the possibility of a stronger counterbalancing coalition that the United States could lead in dealing with China. I think this is an opportunity for democratic reform in the United States, in the sense that COVID has pointed out some flaws in the American system that we might be able to correct through our own political processes. I think it has created the possibility of what I would call reglobalization as opposed to deglobalization. And so instead of simply pulling back from globalization, I think what the United States and other democratic countries should do and perhaps will do is simply try to deepen integration among friendly countries, among democracies, so that they can limit their economic dependence on authoritarian regimes such as China. I think that's a smart move, and you're starting to see some moves in that direction. So Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom has proposed this idea of a D10, a group of 10 leading democracies that would invest together in high technology areas that would provide alternatives to reliance on Chinese technology. I think that's a promising initiative. And then I think a fourth area is it provides some opportunities to reform international institutions. The World Health Organization, the WHO, obviously didn't perform well in dealing with COVID, but there is a possibility of reforming it. And that is traditionally the sort of thing that the United States would be deeply engaged in. But the problem is that all of these opportunities will only be realized if the United States exercises a sort of constructive influence, constructive leadership that it really seems, unfortunately, to have abandoned under President Trump. And so the United States simply withdrew from the World Health Organization rather than trying to participate in the reform. The United States has not contributed to the various vaccine summits we've seen with respect to COVID. Essentially, the United States has signaled that it is taking its ball and going home, that it doesn't want to be involved in these multilateral efforts anymore. And I think that that's a mistake on numerous grounds. So the question, I think, is, can the United States recover? Can it salvage what is left of the achievements of the post-World War II and post-Cold War eras and help to preserve an international system that is now under strain, but has certainly delivered some pretty good results over the last 75 years? And the answer, I think, actually has a lot. It depends a lot on what happens in about 4 weeks in the American presidential election. And so I think if we have one term of President Trump, that American foreign policy and the American-led international system will prove resilient. There was a lot of stickiness in the institutions and relationships that the United States has cultivated over the past 75 years. American alliances, for instance, are deeply institutionalized. There are long-standing patterns of cooperation, which is one of the reasons why, say, the US and German militaries continue to work so well together, even when President Trump and Chancellor Merkel don't seem to get along well together. The United States has basically built up a lot of capital over the last 75 years, and so we can spend that down for a little bit. And I think if you see a return to a more traditional American foreign policy, so if a Biden administration comes to power and essentially says we're going to reinvest in American alliances, we're going to look at ways of getting back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of doing more on climate change and so on and so forth, I think you'll see that a number of American relationships around the world will prove more resilient than you might think. And there's some historical reason to believe this. And so in 2005, 2006, U.S. relations with Europe were still just poisonous as a result of the Iraq War. 3 years later, President Bush has left office, President Obama has come in, and there's a fresh start. And so this is one of the virtues of the American political system. We change leaders every few years, and that gives us a chance to start anew on the international scene. I think it's a different story, though, if we end up with a second term of Trump. And I'm not trying to be political here. I'm just trying to be analytical, because I think the challenge is that if we get a second term of Trump, it becomes more difficult for our friends around the world to explain what's happening as an aberration from the norm in American foreign policy. It looks more like the United States has made a strategic decision to endorse the sort of foreign policy that President Trump has put forward. And I think that would really affect a lot of the calculations of countries around the world. I think countries in Europe would have to start seriously thinking about what it means to be dependent on an unreliable United States. I think you could see the World Trade Organization crippled in a second Trump term because the administration has refused to appoint judges to the appellate court. I think you could see the president might decide that he wants to withdraw from certain American alliances or to pull U.S. troops off the Korean Peninsula or something of that sort. And so I think that the potential for lasting damage goes up significantly in a second Trump term. It'll be mitigated somewhat if we don't have a second Trump term. But regardless of who is elected in November, the fact is that the international environment is more difficult for the United States and for the international order it leads than it has been in at least 30 or 35 years. The rise of China is a fundamental challenge for the United States. I think it's a fundamental challenge for democracies everywhere. And the United States is confronting more competitors on more fronts than it has confronted at any time since the Cold War, certainly. And so whoever is president in 2021 is going to have their work cut out for them if they're trying to preserve the best effects of the grand strategy and the world order that the United States has pursued going back a number of decades. So why don't I stop there in the interest of time, and I look forward to the discussion with everyone.